Hi, you are listening to Baachu Talk, a podcast for government services professionals. My name is Baachu, and I will be sitting down with our government services leaders to share their stories, discuss their career, and learn all about their values and collective impact in our society. Today's guest is Chris Wright. Chris is Chief Executive of Catch22, the social business driving public service reform. He leads a team of 1,800 staff and volunteers that supports over 60,000 people nationally. Chris has over 30 years of experience across the social care and criminal justice systems. Chris trained as a social worker and a probation officer, establishing Nottingham's first multi-agency youth offending team, and also involved on the policy as head of performance at the Youth Justice Board. Chris has long advocated the need for radical social reform of a wide range of public services. Under his leadership, Catch22 has not only delivered significant frontline impact, but has grown its work supporting others to transform their services, from advising government behind closed doors through to supporting and investing in big ideas and small delivery charities. Chris is a 2018 Grant Thornton Face of Vibrant Economy winner, a fellow of the British Exploring Society, a trustee of Community Links, a trustee of Only Connect, a trustee of Catch22 Multi-Academy Trust, and Launch 22, a non-executive director at Capacity, the Public Services Lab, and non-executive director at Big Society Capital. Chris's belief in social justice extends to his commitment to Nottingham Forest, one day returning to cloud glory years. Is also a visiting lecturer at Cass Business School's Center for Charity Effectiveness. Welcome, Chris, to Baachu Talk. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Chris. Chris, let's go back to the very, very earlier part of your life. Where were you born, Chris? And let's talk about your school and your education.
Yeah, well, I was born in Nottingham, so I still live in Nottinghamshire today. But I started school in Nottingham, but my father, not long after I started school, my father joined the Royal Air Force, and so we ended up having a fairly peripatetic childhood. I went to 9 different schools before going off to university. So we Nottingham was always our home. We always used to come back to Nottingham from various postings around the country. And in those days, my dad would be posted somewhere and there'd be nowhere for us to live. So we'd go and live with our grandparents in Nottingham and wait for a house to come up so we could go and live back with my dad.
Wow. So what locations did you move around, Chris, while you were having your school?
Yeah, so I lived in Cornwall, in Norfolk, in Shropshire, in Germany, in Lincoln, and as I said, in Nottingham. So yeah, quite a lot of different places. So I was in Germany from the age of 6 till I was almost 10. And went to school there, but a British Forces school.
Wow! Then you came back to UK for your higher education, Chris?
Yeah. No, I was back in England at the age of 10. Then went to a primary school again in a couple of primary schools, one in Nottinghamshire, and then one in Shropshire. Then I went to I did my secondary school in Bridgnorth in Shropshire. My dad was stationed at RAF Cosford at the time. And I went to Albury Wells Secondary School to do my secondary education. And then I stayed there until I finished my O-levels. And then my dad was posted to Lincoln. I did my A-levels at Lincoln College of Technology, and then I went to university at University of East Anglia in Norwich.
Wow. And what was your first job, Chris? And what was the role?
My first job after university was I got a job selling advertising space, which many people fall into, at Haymarket Publishing in London in 1983. So I was called a sales executive. I was pretty hopeless at it, frankly, but I did that for a year whilst I tried to work out what I was going to do in my life.
That's brilliant. It's good that you had some level of exposure of what you are not good at very early on, because
yeah, I didn't feel I wasn't so bad at the actual job. I could sell, and I've always actually that's been something which is true to to myself today. Really, I've always been good at selling, whether it's selling ideas or selling products, and so I was quite okay at selling advertising, and I used to make my target, but I felt very uncomfortable in the environment. I just didn't feel it was where I wanted to be, and I read politics at university, and so I was interested in discussion and debate and perhaps philosophical and esoteric type subjects. And suddenly I was thrown into this environment where it was all about sell, sell, sell. And it was the early 80s. It was the kind of, era of yuppiedom. And people were, I was working with, I think I don't want to be unfair, but there was a lot of motivation around money. And I realized that wasn't my motivation. I wasn't interested in money per se. And so I decided I'd go and do something else.
So from that role, you moved straight into social working, Chris, of Nottingham City?
Almost, not quite. It took me a little while to find out or to get a foot in the door. And so I ended up having sort of a year just doing various temp jobs. But a guy I'd lived with, shared a house with in London, he had a cousin who was the deputy manager of a children's home. And I'd started to explore the idea of social work. And I thought social work might be a way of being able to express my beliefs and values. And I thought maybe you could use social work as a vehicle for, I can't believe I'm saying this, but changing the world, making the world a better place. And so my former house mate introduced me to his cousin, who, as I said, was a deputy manager in the children's home. And I managed to get a job through him as a residential childcare officer. And in those days, before you could get onto a social work course, you needed to acquire some experience. So I was thrown in at the deep end, working in a children's home which had a secure unit attached to it. And it was pretty stark and a real kind of eye-opener, really, about the complexity of the lives of the children that we were there to look after.
Wow, that's a very powerful entry to the role there, Chris. And from then on, Nottingham City Council Youth Justice Board, can we quickly...
So I stayed in the children's home for a while, and then I worked in a probation hostel in London for a further 2 years. And in those days, the Home Office had a scheme where they would sponsor future probation officers. And but you had to have some experience. So having worked in the probation hostel, I applied to the Home Office to become a sponsored probation officer. And I managed to get that sponsorship. And then I went off to Oxford to do a master's in social work, sponsored by the Home Office. and I did that. That was a further 2 years. And then at the end of that period, I decided I wasn't sure I really wanted to be a probation officer. So I ended up doing VSO, and I went off to Ghana and lived in Ghana for a while as a volunteer for VSO. And then when I came back in early '91, I tried. I thought I was going to. I quite like the idea of having a career in international development, but international development decided it didn't want me to have a career in it. So I was unsuccessful in my efforts to get into that, and so I decided I better become a probation officer then. And that's when I returned to Nottingham and became a probation officer in Nottingham. And then I was there for the next 8 years or so, and then in '99, I set up the first of the new youth offending teams, which came about following the 1998 Crime and Disorder Act. So these were these multidisciplinary new structures which were comprised of education, social work, police, probation, and health workers working together to try and deflect young people from the criminal justice system, and indeed manage them when they were in the criminal justice system. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I went off to the Youth Justice Board, which had been set up by the Crime and Disorder Act to oversee the youth justice system in England and Wales.
It's always a challenge to move from local government to central government. Both are culturally very different, as you rightly said. And it's great that you had this exposure. Being a social worker helped set up the system in local government, then also went to monitor the performance of those systems from the central government that nicely brought you into Catch22. Let's talk a little bit more about Catch22, Chris. I think 15 years with Catch22. How has Catch22 evolved under your leadership?
Yeah, well, Catch22 didn't exist when I went there, actually. So I joined an organisation called RAINA. So this was my first job, having left the Youth Justice Board. I was appointed director of operations at a quite a medium-sized charity called RAINA. RAINA itself had a very illustrious history and had come about through a merger with another organisation called the Royal Philanthropic Society. And the Royal Philanthropic Society charts its history back to 1788, when it was set up to work with the children of felons on the streets of London. In the mid-90s, the Royal Philanthropic Society merged with what was then called the RAINA Foundation. And the RAINA Foundation was famous because Frederick Rayner, who it was named after, was the person who we can trace to the creation of the probation service. He, in 1896, I think it was, he was a journeyman printer on his way to becoming a missionary in Africa. And he made a donation to the Temperance Society, having stopped off in London and been somewhat despairing of what he saw in the magistrates' court, these revolving doors of people being processed by the courts. So he thought there was something that needed to be done about it, and he made this small donation. And that led to the creation of what was known as the London Police Court Mission. And the London Police Court Mission in 1908 became the probation service. And from 1908 till I think the late 1930s, the probation service was run by these court missionaries, and that ended up being translated into the RAINA Foundation. So the RAINA Foundation and the Royal Philanthropic Society in 1996 joined forces, and they became known then as RPS RAINA. and eventually they dropped the RPS and simply became known as Rayner. And I joined Rayner in 2006 as its director of operations. And I hadn't really got much idea about what that really meant. I thought, I knew about running services. I knew about monitoring services. What I hadn't really understood, and this is the point around selling, I hadn't really understood that in order to have the right to deliver those services, we had to win them in the first place. And Rayner, although a charity, wasn't a traditional charity in the sense that people donated money to it. It made its living through delivering contracts on behalf of government. So I moved there, and 2 years after I joined Rayner, Rayner joined forces with another charity called Crime Concern. Crime Concern had been created in 1988, had been set up. Douglas Hurd, who was the Home Secretary at the time, was instrumental in the establishment of Crime Concern. He wanted a charity to help advise him on issues of community safety, and Crime Concern emerged from that. But by 2006, Crime Concern and Rayner were operating in similar sort of space. And so they decided, in 2008, they decided it was time to maybe join forces. And so a merger took place, and a new name was found, and we ended up calling Rayner Crime Concern Catch22. Classically, we'd recruited some trendy branding agency, and they came up with a name. They thought it captured the idea of the people who we were there to support getting caught in catch-22 situations. So they couldn't get jobs because they didn't have anywhere to live. They couldn't get anywhere to live because they couldn't get a job. You see what I mean? Or people were carrying knives because they were worried about being stabbed. But if they didn't carry a knife, they might not be stabbed. So that kind of catch-22 situation and was the rationale behind the name. So Catch-22 was created in 2008. Its first chief executive was the chief executive of Rayner, a woman called Joyce Mosley, and she remained in post for the first 3 years of Catch-22, and then she was reaching retirement. And they ran a process, and I was fortunate enough to become her replacement in June 2011. So I'm just coming up to the beginning of my 10th year as CEO at Catch22.
Wow. And the most interesting thing about Catch22 is this ecosystem of delivery partners and with smaller charities, or your incubation programs for upcoming charities and stuff, Chris. So can you share a little bit more about those things?
These things are evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary. And so when I took over, Catch22 was a provider of a range of public services. But I also took over in 2011. And the coalition government had been elected in 2010, I think. And we had the instigation of so-called austerity. And a lot of the work that Catch22 was doing was seen by many public funders as kind of discretionary work which added value but wasn't core. So I decided that we needed to be much more central to the delivery of core public services. So we started to move in that direction. And then for the first 3 or 4 years of my tenure, we positioned ourselves as an alternative provider of public services. And we started to, we acquired some independent schools. And so we got into the education space. We became much more present in justice through working with some the big outsourcing businesses. And so we kind of purposefully positioned ourselves as an alternative provider of public services. At the time, I read a really interesting paper by a couple of academics and it was published in the Stanford Innovation Review, and it was called "What's Your End Game?" And it challenged social sector organisations to determine what their end game was. And it set out a number of different end game scenarios, and one of which was something it called government adoption. And this really resonated with me. And I thought, yeah, this is what we're about. What I'm really interested in is trying to persuade government that there are different ways of delivering public services. And in order to be able to persuade government, we needed to demonstrate that we were a credible provider of public services. So we win contracts and we deliver those contracts. And even though a lot of those contracts, in my view, don't necessarily create the conditions in which you can deliver really good outcomes, you can still build effective relationships with the people you're there to support. But by winning the confidence of government by being a credible provider, it also allows you potentially to get into a conversation about how you could run public services differently. And so for the last few years, we've tried to position ourselves as a public service reform organisation, and we've managed to win some money to test out innovation of different in different kind of forms, and part of that innovation has meant that we've used our platform to create the conditions where we've invited different organisations and people to come and join us to develop their thinking and their approaches to public services. So, for example, we've for the last 3 years, we've been incubating an organisation called Unlocked Graduates. And Unlocked Graduates it's like Teach First for the prison service. And it was set up to recruit good quality graduates to become prison officers. And has won contracts from the Ministry of Justice to do that. And that sits within Catch22. It will become an independent organisation later this year. Similarly, we've been incubating an organisation called The Lighthouse, which is a new model of running children's homes. And we've created a space for the founder of the Lighthouse to benefit from Catch22's input. And all being well, the Lighthouse will be opening its first children's home early next year. Similarly, we are incubating some employment employability businesses working specifically with ex-offenders. So a guy called Jacob Hill, who runs something called Offploy, is being incubated by Catch22. We're also incubating another organisation called Recruit, which is about creating job opportunities for people with learning disabilities. And we've got another organisation called Devi, which is about a virtual parenting program, virtual coaching for people who need support around parenting. So we've been positioning ourselves as an organisation who wants to try and shift the dial around how public services can be organised, who delivers public services, and trying to get a greater focus on what constitutes good what you need to do to deliver good outcomes.
This big society, capital, business impact challenge winning, and can you share a little bit more about that, Chris?
Big Society Capital, it was established in, again, around 2010. It was set up to steward the creation of a social investment market and was capitalised with £600 million of dormant assets.
Oh.
And in 2014, Big Society Capital ran a competition called the Business Impact Challenge, encouraged corporates to work with organisations like Catch22 to come up with a business idea. And we went into partnership with Interserve and a small boutique finance company called Amberside. We submitted an application to the Business Impact Challenge around the creation of what was known as the Public Service Lab. And the Public Service Lab is now known as Capacity. And we established it in Liverpool with the intention of it acting as a catalyst for rethinking how public services could be delivered by making better use of community organisations. And that idea won, and it's part of the prize was it was invested in by Big Society Capital, and Capacity is now a functioning business in Liverpool, of which Catch22 is one of its members. It's a limited liability partnership, and it's doing really fascinating work. Its chief executive is a guy called Chris Wright. If anybody's interested, check it out. They're doing some remarkable things around rethinking how primary healthcare can be delivered, to how children's residential care can be delivered, and all things in between. But that, so Big Society Capital for me has figured quite prominently. One, because we won that competition, but two, because I'm really interested in social investment. And I managed to, subsequently, I applied for a role on the board of Big Society Capital, and I'm now a non-exec on the Big Society Capital board.
Wow, that's a beautiful journey there, Chris. You've been part of the challenge and won the challenge, made build an impact there with the challenge, and now you're giving more impact by joining the board. That's typical of you. Chris, the British Exploring Society, being a fellow, that sounds pretty exotic, Chris. I mean, you have been recognized for your imagination and enterprise for this Dango Next Generation program. Can you share a little bit more of that, Chris?
Yeah, I can. I mean, this is one of those serendipitous things, really. In fact, before I became a chief executive at Catch22, when I was still director of ops, I was visited by a couple of guys who had an idea. They had an idea that they wanted to sail a tall ship from Bergen in Norway to Tower Bridge, and they wanted to crew the ship with young people who Catch22 typically work with. So young people whose lives were blighted in some way or the other. And these guys were pretty impressive chaps, and they said to me, "Look, Chris, we've rented the ship. Can you find the young people?" And but it wasn't quite as simple as that, because we then also had to raise the money to do it. But back in 2011, we ran our first expedition, where we took a group of young people and they went trekking in the mountains in Norway. They then boarded the ship at Bergen, and they sailed the tall ship back from Bergen to Tower Bridge. I can remember being there on the day it arrived back. I joined them at Tilbury, and we came down the Thames, and we came through Tower Bridge, and they opened Tower Bridge for the tall ship to come in, and we moored against HMS Belfast. And that was 2011, and we did it in partnership. So these two guys who came with the idea, they were both connected to this quite brilliant organisation called British Exploring Society. But British Exploring Society at that time was typically known for adventures for young people who tended to go to public schools. So this was a venture for them to move into a different space. And on the back of that, we run a program now for the last 7 years, following the trip from Bergen. The next year, we took a group of young people to the Sinai Desert with British Exploring Society, and they trekked across the desert. And then for the last 6 years, or 7 years, we've gone to Iceland on a geothermal expedition every year and taken a group of young people. And so I've championed this, and Catch22 has invested in it and supported this program. And as a recognition, I think, for my involvement in it, the British Exploring Society honoured me with a fellowship 2 years ago. So I'm in great company. Ralph Fiennes is a fellow as well, and there are a few serious explorers who have got a fellowship. I'm sort of a bit of I find myself a bit of an imposter, really, because I'm not a proper explorer or anything. But I'm fortunate to be in their company.
Wow, it's brilliant, Chris, because what I'm hearing, and also I'm sure when the listeners hear it, it's your amazing ability to connect the dots. It's like, okay, you as Catch22 charity, social business, specialize in 4 or 5 sectors. And then when somebody else in a smaller organization comes back with the same ethos or around the same thing, you're always willing to go to the extra mile to make that part of what you are doing. That's amazing. And that's one thing which come across really strongly, Chris. And you didn't stop there. You were also a visiting lecturer at Catch Business School Center for Charity Effectiveness, Chris. Can you share a little more about that?
Yeah, well, that's very recent, actually. So I only started that this February. I was invited to, there's a master's program that they run. And one of the modules on the program is on social enterprise. And the course leader is a guy called Mark Solway. And I got to know Mark over the years. And he used to run the program with another great third sector leader called Craig Dearden Phillips. And Craig had decided he needed to step away from it. And so there was an opportunity for me to step into Craig's shoes. So I somewhat tentatively said, yes, I would. And so I've only been doing it since February. And in fact, I've just been marking my first essays, which is interesting and a different challenge. So I've enjoyed it, but I think I need to do it for a bit longer before I feel comfortable and confident that I'm adding any real value there.
100%, Chris, because what not? Local government, central government running a solid social enterprise incubation program, a brilliant delivery ecosystem, delivering an alternative mechanism to deliver public services, and now coming to teach Catch Business School, bringing up the next generation, Chris. It'll all fall in place. I'm absolutely sure about that. So, why do you think the social business like Catch22 can be alternative providers to deliver public services?
Well, that's a really good question because, and it goes back to my kind of 30-odd year journey, really. I've become increasingly convinced that the state as the default producer of public services is not the best way of delivering public services. I think, and also, I also don't think classic outsourcing is either. I think we have to find a different model, a model which allows for agile, transformative type businesses to play a role, businesses which are not going to extract too much value for distribution, but value which can be recycled and re-engineered to think differently about how public services can be developed and improved. So in a nutshell, over the last 30, 40 years, I think public services, and this is a generalization, but public services have become increasingly bureaucratic. They've become very risk averse. They tend to be compliance led. They're focused on process, and they're not that good at delivering outcomes. And therefore, I think there's a different way of delivering the kind of services that people need in order to be able to fulfill their potential. And that way is the marriage of good commercial discipline with social purpose. And that's where you arrive at something like a social business.
Oh, that's beautifully said, Chris. Beautifully said. Probation outsourcing, Chris, or rehabilitation. It's been a sticky topic for a long time, Chris. I mean, insourcing, outsourcing. Many of the providers have even gone under. Some are failing. You as a social business, Chris, have been delivering this. What do you think is the right thing to do in this sector, from your opinion?
If you look at reconviction rates, they remain stubbornly high. People come out of custody, and if you're under 18, I think there's a 75% chance of you being reconvicted within 12 months. Yeah. If you're an adult, then I think that figure's around 55%. My stats might be slightly wrong. And in the community, similarly, there are high reconviction rates. And it suggests to me that we need to think differently about how we go about delivering those kind of services. And so I totally understand the importance of accountability and public safety and all those things. But what I'm interested in is a model which allows the best capability there is to come to the fore to be able to deliver the best quality services required. And for me, those services don't have to be delivered within a state apparatus. They're probably better if they're delivered through different kind of models which allow for agile, nimble thinking, give people autonomy to act, and encourage good performance. And I just think there's something, it might sound a bit harsh, but I think there's a sclerosis in bureaucracy which gets in the way of delivering the best possible outcomes. And therefore, I think we should look at different kind of business models for delivering services such as probation.
Chris, you have achieved so much in this 30-year career, Chris. What do you think are your key achievements so far?
I'd like to think, there's some, practical examples of things, that I've done, which I'm proud of. From setting up something like capacity in Liverpool was something I really was very proud of. But also, setting up the youth offending team back in 1999 was a big thing for me. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about government. I learned a lot about, how you needed the support of central government to make something happen. I suppose one of the things I'm most proud of is I've been able to reinvent myself and brush myself down, and when things have gone wrong, I pick myself back up again and have another go at things. I've met some amazing people who've been brilliant to me, who supported me and enabled me and encouraged me. And I think the thing I've learned about more than anything is that you need people to help you along the way. And I know in my life there are, a handful of people who have been very, very important in enabling things to happen. and I'm hugely grateful to those people.
Oh, that's beautifully said, Chris. Chris, tell me the 3 things not many people know about you.
Well, I think I could probably get. I'm rubbish at. I'm really rubbish at DIY.
Okay.
I suppose I'm kind of last minute Jack. So I tend to do things at the last minute as opposed to if I'm really honest, properly planning things through. And what's the third thing that I'm sure people know that about me as well, by the way. And the third thing is, well, I find it really hard to, if you're at a conference or in a seminar or in a gathering with people I don't really know, I can never really ask a question. I always find it very hard to raise my head above the pedestal. I'm okay if I'm asked to speak and I'm I'm delivering a paper or something, but if I'm in the audience and I have to ask a question, I find that very, very difficult.
Chris, COVID-19, we all are here. When you received the message, Chris, late March, where were you and what was the first thing that you did?
Yeah, well, I was in London and this was just shortly before lockdown. And so it was becoming increasingly obvious that we were going to move to lockdown. Our head office is in central London. I think people were finding it very concerning traveling across London. And so we took a decision on the Tuesday before the Prime Minister's announcement on the Monday, I think the 23rd of March. We took it on the Tuesday before to close our London office and to start to move our corporate operations to working from home. So by the time of the formal lockdown, I'd come back up to Nottinghamshire and I'd established myself here and set up my kind of home office. We quickly mobilised. There was certain serendipity about this. We'd been rolling out Microsoft 365 from the beginning of the year, so our team were getting used to 365, and one of the functionalities on that is Microsoft Teams. And we were able to get everybody in the organisation almost onto Teams within a couple of weeks. So yeah, that's where I was, and that's what we did, and that's where we still are.
Perfect, Chris. How are you adapting to this new normal yourself from running this social business located in multiple directions, running multiple contracts? How are you adapting in the new normal?
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of kind of moments where you worry about what the future holds, but I think we're also I'm slightly worried it's becoming a cliche, but I think we're amazed how quickly people do adapt to working in different environments and from home. And, it's led us to think very seriously about what the future does look like and whether we need to continue to do the things that we've historically done or whether we can build on the new model. I'm concerned about, a second wave like everybody else is. And we've got to make sure we look after our staff and we look after our service users. I think one thing I do want to say is, although, there's been a lot of talk about digitization and the benefit of new technology, a lot of the people we typically work with are excluded from the benefits of digitization because a lot of people we work with, they don't benefit from the utility of broadband. They might not have the hardware. So there's a real digital divide in this country. And I'm very mindful that whatever my privileged position is granted me, so I can operate from my nice house. I've got a garden. A lot of people who we support don't have the benefit of those things. And so I think we mustn't ever forget that in crises like this, and I know people say this is unprecedented, but in crises, the people who tend to suffer the most are the people who are always the poorest in the first place, or the most vulnerable.
Lockdown Diaries, Catch22 Lockdown Diaries. I've been keeping an eye on that for a while. It's brilliant what you and team are doing. That any inspiring stories and shout outs within Catch22 family or any of your service users?
Yeah, this is a shout out just to the organisation. The reason we've been producing the Lockdown Diaries is because we've wanted to let the world know that we're still busy, we're still doing stuff, we're finding different ways of working with the people we support, and whether that's through our schools, which have remained open, even though a lot of the children sadly have not been coming, to working in prisons where people are having to be very imaginative about how they can support people behind bars. I have huge regard. We've been producing lots of different case studies, and there's all kinds of anybody who wants to just check out some of the Lockdown Diaries, have a look on our website, and you'll see the breadth of energy and imagination and vision. A huge thanks to all of our people for continuing in often difficult circumstances. So we run a number of child sexual exploitation and missing services, and our people have been going out still and finding young people who have gone missing, who are still at risk of being sexually exploited. Because everybody is in lockdown doesn't mean that people are not being taken advantage of. So our teams who are doing that work are phenomenal. We run a mental health program in Camden, and a lot of the users there, are still presenting with suicidal ideation and need the input from our workers. So there's a plethora of different stories and energy and imaginative approaches to engaging with the people we support. And I'm just hugely admiring and humbled by people who continue day in, day out trying to deliver their services.
That's beautiful, Chris. Chris, there are many stories that, as you rightly said, are there in case studies in there. But what have you personally observed lately that reminded you that people are good or kind?
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? I think there has been an increase in neighborliness. Certainly, I've felt that people know that it's important to say hello to each other. I just think I fundamentally believe that people are kind, that people are good, and the vast majority of people's motivation is the right thing. They want to do the right thing for the people their loved ones, the people they live around. And so, in the hurly-burly of, modern life, sometimes we forget those things. And so maybe because things have slowed down a bit, we're just recognizing the stuff that's there, that underpins everything about us. I don't want to sound too, naive and idealistic, but I do genuinely believe people are good. And what this situation is demonstrating is people's goodness.
100%, Chris. You're not naive at all. I just, like, as you rightly said, this is where there are so many unsung heroes in the communities who stepped up. They didn't wait for the central government or let alone local government. They just went on. They helped their colleagues, helped their community, and beautifully said, Chris. The last 15 minutes, Chris, and let's do some rapid random fire questions, Chris. This is chill out a little bit. Chris, a Nottingham Forest fan. How long have you been the Nottingham Forest fan, Chris? And when was the first time you actually saw Nottingham play?
Yeah, well, as I said, I was born in Nottingham. So I was born the son of a Nottingham Forest fan. I can't remember the first time I saw Forest play. I think the first time I went on my own, I was about 14. So that was a long time ago, and I've had a season ticket now since I came back to Nottingham in 1992. So I go with the same group of people who I've been going with for all those years. It's got, as I say, the same group. The group's got bigger and smaller depending on the success of Forest. So latterly, it's been quite a small group. We've not had much success in the last 25 years, but I'm very Nottingham Forest is it's part of me, and I can't imagine a day when I don't have a season ticket.
That's brilliant, Chris. So let's just go with that. If you could be an Olympic athlete, in what sport would you compete?
I really like road cycling. I'm useless at it. I'm not very good on hills. We go to the south of France, southwest France, usually for our holidays, my wife and I, and we cycle in the Midi-Pyrenees, and she's always at the top of the hills before me. But if I could have had a dream, I'd love to have be a road cyclist and win a gold medal in the road race at the Olympics.
Nice, Chris. So as a child, what did you wish to become when you grew up?
As I started to, move from O levels to A levels, I was thinking about journalism. And I mentioned, I arrived in a publishing company, flogging advertising space, but I always wanted to be a writer. I was very interested in journalism. And I can remember I was doing my A-levels, and I can remember seeing an advert to be a researcher on a program called World in Action. And I was thinking, that must be the greatest job ever. And I worked in a pub. I was doing my A-levels in Lincoln. I worked in a pub. And the local TV news crew from Calendar, it was a Yorkshire TV news program. They used to drink in the pub, and I managed to get them to take me out filming with them a few times, but that was as close as I got.
So what's the most courageous thing you have ever done in your life?
When I went to work in Ghana as a volunteer, that was quite courageous for me, because I wasn't, I quite like my home comforts, and I was thrust into an environment which was quite different, and I hadn't anticipated it. And so I don't think I was very courageous, but I think it was probably foolhardy more than courageous.
Which storybook or a movie or a cartoon character is very similar to who you are as a person?
It's a good question. I played decent level football at university, and I used to play in goal. And there was a book written by a great journalist called Brian Glanville, and it was called Goalkeepers Are Different. I can remember that book meant a lot to me. And so the character in that book was who if I was going to be anybody, it would have been that character. It was tracing his career, the ups and downs of his career.
Wow, that's a very powerful one. So when you're having a bad day, Chris, what do you do to make yourself feel better?
I talk to people. I think the best way of dealing with tough times or frustrations is just by having conversations with people you trust and who you can seek advice from and test ideas out and test thinking out. Yeah, so I talk to people.
That's brilliant. So who haven't you seen or talked to in a long time and you hope that they're doing okay?
So, it's a really interesting question because, I've been reading quite a bit about how people have become quite introspective over the last few weeks and reflective of their lives. And I, without, specific individuals, I've thought back to, friends that, we've not seen for a long while, or people who it's interesting, isn't it? You're only at school for a relatively short period of time, but many of the people you're at school with become quite, they're seared on in your memory. And I've been sort of thinking about some of those people recently. People who I haven't seen for 45 years. So I don't know. It's just. And then this is very just, my both my parents are dead, and you just think it would be really lovely to just have another dinner with your mum and dad.
That's beautiful, Chris. Chris, I know you like music. What song do you sing only when you're alone, and what memory does it bring back?
I'm the most dreadful singer. I also can't ever remember any words of any song, which is pathetic. I love music, and I'm not very eclectic. My music taste. I'm into sort of folk, contemporary folk. I'm into sort of rock singers who talk about life. So I'm fascinated by people like Springsteen and Dylan and Neil Young and all those. But I can't. If you were to ask me to name a song or to sing a song, I just wouldn't be able to. I love a show on Radio 6. Mark Ratcliffe and Stuart McConey. They do a show on Saturday and Sunday mornings, and they have all these musos on who know so much about music, and I always feel really embarrassed because I can't ever answer any of the questions. So it's a flaw.
Got you. So if you write a book about your autobiography, what would be the title of your book?
The Return of Forrest.
Nice. Okay. So what advice would you give someone wanting to pursue a career similar to yours?
I suppose the advice I'd offer anyone is ultimately don't let anybody judge you. Be your own judge.
That's brilliant. So who are the people who have been the most influential in your life and career?
I mentioned earlier, that there are a few people who've had a very kind of significant role in my life. From my parents to people who've been strategically at the right place at the right time. So they've given me a bit of a nudge, and I can name some names. When I was in probation in Nottingham, there was a great man called Malcolm Ayres who he gave me an opportunity probably before I deserved it, which opened up a door for me. And then guy at Catch22, I'll always be grateful to Jim McKenna, who was the chairman who appointed me as the CEO. And he was chairman when I was the director of operations, and he encouraged me and gave me a platform. I'm very blessed.
100%, Chris. Who's the kindest person you know, Chris?
That's a very good question. I can name lots of kind people. I see a lot of kindness in the work that I do. The people who, do go, it's a bit of a cliche, but go the extra mile. I think I'm always humbled, actually, by people's kindness. And, kindness takes many forms, doesn't it? I'm always impressed by people who give you time. Time's a really important gift, and time to be listened to, and then you wonder whether you can be kind to yourself. And that we're confronted with so many kind of occasions when you pass on by and maybe you wish you hadn't passed by.
That's beautiful, Chris. It's one thing you wish you had known when you began your career.
Patience, I think. Always be in a hurry. Time does pass very quickly, but sometimes when you think you're ready and you might not quite be ready, so be a bit more patient.
That's beautiful advice, Chris. And what is the piece of advice you have received, and from whom?
I mentioned him earlier when I went to the Youth Justice Board, Norman Warner, and I was floundering a little bit in my new role there. And I said to him one day, I said, Norman, I just don't understand what level of authority I've got. And he said, Chris, you have to seize your own authority. So that's pretty good advice. Don't assume that authority is going to be ascribed to you. You need to seize it, and then maybe you have it.
That's a great one, Chris. And the last one, what's something you're looking forward to in the future?
I'm looking forward to having a pint.
That's a great one, Chris. And is there any part of your life or career that we haven't touched, Chris, that maybe you can spend the last 1 or 2 minutes on?
Well, I think this has been a very thorough questioning session. So not really. I mean, I think I've tried to take you on a journey. It's not always been, as I said, it's sometimes I've been a bit impatient to move into new situations and wondered why they haven't happened, and that's the sort of lesson around patience. I sometimes think like everybody, you always worry whether you've done enough, whether you could have made different decisions, but you are what you are, and you just have to be what you are, and be grateful for the opportunities you've been given.
That's beautifully said, Chris. You are what you are. What a final line. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. It's really been to have a privilege to have you with us very early on at Baachu Talk on the Kindness series. Wish you, Catch22 colleagues, and everybody around you all the good health and happiness. Please continue to inspire everybody, and stay safe, stay healthy, and stay kind, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pastor. I've enjoyed it.
To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Please do visit baachu.com/Baachu Talk podcast to this specific episode link to everything that was mentioned in this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and share Baachu Talk podcast with your loved ones. We will see you at the next episode with another special guest. Until then, it's Bhaskar Sundaram from Baachu signing off.